Hello. Welcome again as we continue to look at evidences for the historical reliability of the Bible. Last week, among other things, I mentioned the picture of King Jehu, which appears on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser, which dates from the 9th century BC. I also mentioned the reference to Omri, who was king of Israel earlier in that century, and how that the Assyrians, even in later years, referred to Israel as Omriland. Another archaeological discovery from the 9th century BC that mentions Omri is the Mesha stele, also known as the Moabite stone. In this monument, King Mesha of Moab tells of being dominated by Israel under King Omri, who is mentioned not once but twice, one time as King of Israel. It also tells about the wars with Omri's descendants. The Mesha stele parallels the biblical story found in 2 Kings chapter 3, although with the expected spin on it and the telling of it from a Moabite perspective. Mesha is mentioned by name in the Bible as the king of Moab and as one who paid tribute to the king of Israel. This appears to be confirmed by the text of the Mesha stele. The Bible also speaks of the successful rebellion of the king of Moab during the time of Omri's descendants. This also seems to be confirmed by the text of the Mesha stele, with a portion of the relevant section seen here. I assaulted the wall and captured it, and killed all the warriors of the city. I removed from it all the spoil. I took it, and I killed in all 7,000 men. The word Israel is found 6 times in the Mesha stele, some of the earliest references to Israel outside of the Bible, though not the earliest. More on that next week. The Mesha stele also contains the first mention outside of the pages of the Bible of the name of God, Yahweh, or Jehovah. But this takes us back to the 9th century BC. What about earlier? In previous weeks, I've mentioned discoveries that refer to biblical stories from earlier times, including the Balaam inscription and the Goliath shard. But what about the stories regarding a united kingdom of Israel under Saul, David, and Solomon? Critics have argued that such figures didn't actually exist, and that the stories about them were created out of thin air many centuries later. They had been especially critical of the existence of David, one of the quintessential early figures in Israelite history. As we go farther back in time, the ravages of time make finding historical records more difficult. Can we still find any? Critics were confident about their claims of the non-existence of King David and his kingdom until excavations in 1993 and 1994 in the area of the ancient city of Dan. Dan was the northernmost city in Israel and lay near the border between Israel and Aram, also known later as Syria. There was found here the remains of a monument now referred to as the Tel Dan stele that was written in Aramaic and erected by an Aramean king. Although the name of the Aramean king isn't mentioned, the circumstances mentioned in the text make it fairly certain that it was Hazael, an Aramean king mentioned in the Bible. In a broken section of the stele that we can still piece together, with help from the context, there are mentions of the 9th century BC Israelite kings Jehoram and Ahaziah. There is another figure who is mentioned as king of Israel and the father of Jehoram. This would seem to be Ahab, although the text is broken and missing at that point. But the most significant part of the document is its reference to these biblical figures being of the house of David. This is a statement not made by an Israelite writer, but by an enemy Aramean king, who is referring to events that took place only a little more than 100 years after the death of King David, and less than a century after the death of King Solomon. Biblical figures are slowly but surely coming to light in recent archaeological discoveries. King David was real after all. As a side note, this may not be the earliest known record of the phrase House of David. In the Mesha stele, which we looked at earlier, there is a portion that is broken off that contains the words house of, with the last name only partially present. The word David will fit, but others will also. Many believe that House of David was the original reading. Both the Mesha stele and the Tel Dan stele are 9th century BC monuments, and it is not certain which one is actually earlier. But it is possible, but not certain, that the Mesha stele also refers to the House of David. 20 miles west-southwest of Jerusalem, excavations began in 2007 at a site known as Kirbet Qeiyafa. It apparently was a fortress city overlooking the Elah Valley. It has been dated back to the late 11th century BC. There have been various things discovered there that cause most archaeologists to believe that it was not a Philistine or Canaanite fortress, but an Israelite fortress. Among the various features is the architectural style. Philistine and Israelite architectural styles were quite different. Another factor has to do with diet. A large number of bone remains of many different types of animals have been found. However, one type of bone that wasn't found was that of pigs, which were forbidden to be eaten in Israelite culture, but which were widely dispersed in other cultures of the area. One of the ostraca, that is, a broken piece of pottery that is often used for writing, has been found that, although only partially legible, has one possible reconstruction that reads like this: Judge the slave and the widow, judge the orphan and the stranger, plead for the infant, plead for the poor and the widow, rehabilitate the poor at the hands of the king, protect the poor and the slave, support the stranger. Not only does this seem to echo some biblical texts, but the mention of the king is especially interesting as well. It indicates, therefore, not just a king, but also a kingdom. There's growing consensus that the excavations at Kibbutz Kaiafa are those of a fortress city that was Israelite in the 10th and 11th centuries BC, and therefore part of the kingdom of Israel at the time of Saul, David, and Solomon. Other recent excavations, beginning in 2006 at Tel Eitan, believed by many to be the biblical city of Eglon, have uncovered another fortress city with architecture and other features easily identified as Israelite and from the same time period, 10th to 11th century BC. The extensive complex of structures found included one particular building that has been termed the governor's residence in archaeological circles, and it is suggested to have been an administrative center of a high-ranking official. The discoveries at Tel Eitan and at Kibbutz Kaiafa show that there were Israelite fortresses in the land at the time of the United Kingdom. And another discovery that is of increasing interest, although still not certain, has to do with recent excavations in Jerusalem of structures called the large stone structure and the step stone structure. The large stone structure only began to be uncovered in 2005. Evidence on site would seem to date it back to the 10th century BC. Although it cannot be completely excavated due to families currently living in the area, there is increasing support for the idea that the large stone structure and the step stone structure may be part of the same large and monumental building, a royal palace, the palace of David and his son Solomon. Due to limitations on which areas can be excavated, the conclusions are not certain, but the more commonly held view is beginning to lean in that direction. If so, it would join Kibbutz Kaiafa, Tel Eitan, and the Tel Dan stele as recent discoveries that shed increasing light on the truth of the biblical story during this time. Although there are many more evidence that we can look at, next week will be the end of the quarter and the last week in this series of studies. Hope to have you back again next week.